Hey guys, today I'd like to show you how to play Skyward Sword with a regular controller such as the DualShock 4 or Xbox One controller through the Dolphin emulator. With the configuration profile I've created, you'll be able to play through the entirety of the main game without a Wiimote or any motion or gyro controls. It will take some getting used to, however for me the small learning curve was worth being able to play this game on a controller, and playing like this is now second nature to me. One thing I want to note at the start is that this setup isn't perfect, but it's about as close as I think we can realistically get without the use of a Wiimote. So rather than a quick tutorial and leaving you to figure out the rest, I want to demonstrate how well I think this setup works throughout the entirety of the game. I'll show you as many examples as I can to demonstrate how I got through the game without the use of a Wiimote. I'll be assuming that you already know how to interface your controller to your PC, as there are plenty of tutorials out there already that can help you set that up. Before you start, you'll need to download the Wiimote configuration profiles that I've linked in the description and place them in your Wiimote configuration profiles folder. This can be found at Documents, Dolphin Emulator, Config, Profiles, Wiimote. Alternatively, you can just manually map the buttons and motion emulation using the screenshots of my settings that I've also linked in the description. To start off, I want to quickly go over where I've mapped each button, and then I'll demonstrate all of Link's regular movement and abilities. I've tried to keep everything intuitive and as close to the game's original mappings as possible so that it's less confusing to translate the on-screen button prompts to your controller, and so that you don't have weird mappings like pressing select to charge a skyward strike. So first of all, the nunchuck's analog stick is remapped to the left analog stick, as you would expect. You'll need to calibrate this for your own controller in the Extension tab in the controller configuration page in Dolphin. C is set to L1 for first person mode and dowsing, Z is set to L2 for targeting, the Wiimote D-pad is set to our controller's D-pad, A is set to both X and R1 for everything from talking to NPCs to sprinting and using weapons, which I'll explain later, B is set to square for equipping weapons, plus is set to circle to open the map, minus is set to triangle to get out items, 1 is set to start to open the menu, and 2 is now select to open the help menu. For this configuration, we'll be using the right analog stick to emulate basically all of the Wiimote's motion controls, but most importantly, to swing Link's sword. This is achievable because the right analog stick is mapped to emulate both a pointing and swinging motion. It's easy to swing your sword in the desired direction, and I've set it up in a way that minimises the sword accidentally swinging back or stabbing when the analog stick is released. Aiming the sword for certain mechanics will require slower movements of the analog stick, otherwise you'll end up triggering a swinging motion. I found there was a fine balance between getting sword swings to register without latency, yet having enough of a dead zone to make pointing the sword actually usable without the need for a dedicated sword pointing configuration profile. Luckily, there are only a handful of moments in the game where aiming the sword like this is important, so I found this setup acceptable for my playthrough. Like with the left analog stick, you'll need to calibrate the point, tilt, and swing for each profile for your controller. These can be found in the Motion Simulation tab in the controller configuration page. Just hit Calibrate and make circles with your analog stick until the circle on the screen isn't adjusting anymore, then hit Finish Calibration. Additionally, the L3 and R3 inputs trigger the shield bash and sword stab. Having the shield bash mapped to L3 makes both rolling and spin attacks very easy to pull off. Simply press down on L3 while sprinting to roll, and simultaneously press L3 with a horizontal or vertical swing to perform a spin attack. This also makes it easy to perform fatal blows. While targeting the enemy with L2, just press L3 and swing the sword downwards. Throwing objects that are stabbed onto the sword is also very simple. Stab an object with R3, then swing the sword in the direction you want to throw the object. Skyward strikes are also achievable by simply holding the right analog stick slightly upwards to begin the charge. It can be a little finicky to find the exact place on your analog stick for this, The reason being that I've set the Wiimote pointing emulation to a maximum of 60 degrees when the analog stick is fully pressed in any direction. This was a trade-off to ensure that items that use the emulated pointing to aim, such as the slingshot, as well as other actions like swimming, have an acceptable range of motion. For example, if I were to set the maximum to 45 degrees, the sword would be able to point vertically at the upper edge of the analog stick, but the crosshair would be unable to move to the edge of the screen in first-person view, making for sluggish aiming. Considering Skyward strikes are used much less than the first-person view, and generally without any time constraints, I thought this was a worthy sacrifice to make for general playability. Next up is the jumping sword attack. As I mentioned earlier, we have set the A button to both X and R1. One of the reasons for this is so that we can be sprinting with our index finger on R1 and simultaneously swing the sword with our thumb to pull off a running jump attack. You can also do the jump attack while standing still by holding L2 to target, jumping forward with R1 and swinging the sword while in midair. Technically, you could do the running jump attack by either nudging the analog stick with your knuckle while running with X, or by using a claw grip to press both, but I wanted to make this as easy as possible and to minimize the use of a claw grip. So even though the Wiimote's A button has two mappings on our controller, I like to think of them as having their own functions. X as the general interactions button, and R1 as the sprinting and item button use. Although to be honest, I ended up using them interchangeably at times as well. Selecting items and weapons from the item wheels is the only time in this setup that you'll need to use a claw grip. Hold the square or triangle button to open the wheel and select an item with the analog stick. Now, to use items that require aiming, we have probably the most complicated part of this setup. Because the right analog stick is set to trigger a sword swing so easily, you're basically guaranteed to trigger a swing while aiming, which will cancel you out of the item you were using. So what I've done is given R2 a custom command to disable the swinging motion of the right analog stick. Basically, if you just think of R2 as your aiming trigger and learn to hold it every time you want to aim in first person view, you won't have any sword swinging troubles. So with that one addition to get used to, aiming becomes relatively simple. Get out your weapon, such as the slingshot, hold R2 with your middle finger, aim with the right analog stick, and shoot with R1. You can still move Link around freely with the left analog stick, and also target an enemy with L2 if you want. Occasionally, the crosshair won't recenter correctly, so you'll need to let go of the analog stick and hit down on the D-pad to recenter it. This is a problem with Wiimote play as well though, so you're not at a disadvantage here. This method of aiming will work with the slingshot, bow, claw shot, and gust bellows. Next up is the beetle. You'll aim it by holding R2 in the same way as the other items, but once you release the beetle, I found the best way to fly it was by letting go of R2 and using smaller movements with the right analog stick. If you hold R2, you don't get enough of a turning circle, but without it, full range analog stick movements can be a bit erratic. You get used to using the smaller movements to fly relatively quickly, and it becomes quite easy to do it this way in the end. You can also use R1 to speed up, L2 to get the top-down view, and both together to drop bombs. Bombs are very easy to use. Simply move the right analog stick up if you want to throw, down if you want to roll, and then flick in the opposite direction to release the bomb. You can curve your roll as well by sliding the analog stick left or right while it's held downwards. This method also applies to other throwable and rollable objects such as pots, rocks, and barrels. The bug net and whip are functionally the same as the sword here. For the bug net, use smaller, slow movements to move it around and use flicks to swing. Same goes for the whip. Next up is swimming. I hold R1 to begin swimming and found that a combination of moving with and without holding R2 yielded the best results. Like with the beetle, the aiming can be a bit erratic at times, so I held R2 while making broader directional changes and swam without it for sharper turns. L3 is used to perform the underwater spin attack. Note that Link can't swim at steep angles with R2 pressed, so you'll need to release it in order to get enough of an angle to dive out of the water. Once again, you'll get used to it and it eventually becomes pretty easy. Next, I'll be going over some of the other emulated motion movements. When an enemy grabs onto you, or you get stuck in a web, just waggle the right analog stick and press and hold L3. When using ladders or climbing vines, you can simply flick the right analog stick to leap in the desired direction. While tight roping, you can just flick left or right to lean in the desired direction and flick up to jostle. I found an easy way to tightrope was to slowly alternate between left and right. To swing on vines, just press back to swing forward and forward to swing backwards. It's counterintuitive, but it's just the way it works here. When freefalling, you do have some limited movement in this configuration profile. You use the right analog stick to move forwards and backwards, though this is inverted like with the vine swinging. As with some of the other movements, smaller and slower inputs work better here. You can also rotate clockwise and counterclockwise with sideways movements of the analog stick, but you can't actually move to the left and right. This is fine for most cases, as you can just rotate Link so that your destination is in front of you and then move forward. But there are parts of the game where more freedom of movement is necessary, such as for the Fun Fun Island minigame. This is where our second configuration profile comes in. The flying profile, which I'll discuss shortly, I made specifically for flying the Loftwing, but in addition to flying, it has the added benefit of being useful for movement during freefall. If you use this profile, you can move left and right with the left analog stick, as well as having access to the same movements you had in the main profile. You can also be a bit more liberal with your stick movements, as it's a bit more stable, but personally I didn't find the need to change to this profile during my main playthrough, so it's really just an option if you need the precision. Moving on to flying, as I just mentioned, I had to make a second configuration profile for this. Flying just doesn't work in the main profile because you need to emulate Wiimote rotation in order to steer left and right, so you'll need to swap between them every now and then. This isn't really too much trouble though if you just keep the configuration page running in the background and Alt-Tab to it when you need to change profiles, which I could usually do by the time the game loads into flying mode. Movement is really simple here, just use the left analog stick to move left and right. Up and down are inverted, but you can change that if you're not into it. To get your Loftwing to flap its wings, you just need to flick the analog stick up or down and release it immediately. To do a charge attack, just press R3. Top-down view is L2, and to dive is D-pad down. The rest of the buttons are as they were in the main profile. For this next part of the video, I'm going to be getting into some of the less frequently used motion controls, but ones that nevertheless need to be usable to complete the game. First of all is the door puzzles for the dungeons. This one is by no means perfect, but it's still very doable. Instead of being able to freely rotate the door key, you'll need to grab it with R1 and move it bit by bit with smaller rotations using the right analog stick. It takes a bit of jigging around when you need to move the key clockwise and anti-clockwise, but it's still possible with a bit of effort. Shooting the cannons is simple enough, just use the right analog stick to aim and fire with R1 as usual. For the Rickety Coaster minigame, you'll use the flying profile, as you need to emulate Wiimote rotation once again in order to lean the minecart left and right. As with flying, this is as simple as holding left or right on your left analog stick, and to jump, flicking either up or down on the analog stick works fine. Next up is the harp. This was the third and last thing I had to create a separate profile for. It was extremely difficult to get the broad, slow and steady movements required while still using the main profile. With this profile, it's as simple as holding R1 and moving the analog stick fully left or right. Link will perform a nice, smooth, sweeping motion without the need to manually drag your analog stick. One caveat here is that it's really only possible to emulate one speed of sweeping motion for the harp per profile, so I'm fairly sure it's impossible to do well enough on the Lumpy Pumpkin harp minigame to get the harp piece as a reward, and therefore impossible to complete the game 100% without a Wiimote. After you complete one of the harp challenges with Fi to open the Silent Realm, you're required to stab your sword into the ground. I couldn't find a proper way to emulate this, but luckily if you just move the right analog stick around erratically for a few moments, you'll eventually trigger a movement that's close enough to get Link stabbing downwards. This also works for a moment in the second half of the game where you need to pull your sword out from the ground. Slightly related to the harp, you'll need to draw on the walls with your sword in some parts of the game. Most of these are for the goddess walls, which are completely optional, but you'll need to complete at least one of these drawings to progress through the main storyline. Once again, you can just use the main profile and slowly move the sword to draw what you need. Honestly, the results are never pretty, but luckily the game is reasonably lenient with how badly you draw, so at least for the one in the main storyline, I didn't have any problem. Getting fairies out of a goddess wall, on the other hand, was basically impossible. Last of all, I just want to quickly cover menuing and map selection, seeing as those use pointing emulation as well. There isn't much to say here except that you just use the main profile and the right analog stick to point at what you want with some degree of difficulty. Keep in mind though that a lot of the menuing can actually be done with the left analog stick and left and right on the D-pad to change pages, which will give you a more traditional controller-based experience. I actually played through half of the game without realizing this. The only time the left analog stick isn't an option is when viewing the map or when selecting a bird statue to drop down to. In those instances, you'll use the right analog stick to aim and R1 to select a location. So that's all of the motion controls that I can think of that you'll come across during a playthrough of Skyward Sword. I just want to reiterate that I played through the entirety of the game with these 3 controller profiles and found it to be a really enjoyable experience. I think if Nintendo decided to do a proper port of this game without the motion controls, they could quite easily take a similar approach to mine and refine it even more for an incredible experience. Mostly, I think they would just need to create contextual control mappings and parameters. For example, when aiming weapons, they could program the game to aim normally without my R2 workaround, and just have the ability to swing the sword disabled while aiming. They could also mimic my profile changes by giving the analog sticks different parameters when going into flying mode or using the harp. The harp itself could have a modifier button for faster strokes. Swimming and flying the beetle could also be refined quite easily. Stabbing your sword into the ground only needs to be an A button prompt. Skyward strikes could perhaps be made more simple by holding up on the analog stick while targeting. The list goes on, but I think you get the idea. So I hope this video helps anyone looking to play Skyward Sword with a regular gamepad. Whether you just don't like the motion controls, or if you're like me and have bad wrists or other accessibility problems, I think this is a great alternative to the Wiimote and Nunchuck setup. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to help out. Thanks for watching.